This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on ASEAN, a cornerstone of India's Act East policy. The participants are Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, strategic analyst, and Manush Pratim Bhuiya, journalist.
Professor Kondapalli, Prime Minister Narendra Modi today attended the annual India-ASEAN Summit in Jakarta. The ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is considered one of the most influential groupings in the region. And India and several other countries, including the US, China, Japan, and Australia, are its dialogue partners. So how do you see India's overall engagement with ASEAN in the last few years? We have seen a significant upswing in the ties, particularly in the maritime and trade domains. So how do you see the progress of ties in the last few years?
I think one of the significant outcomes of this 20th India-ASEAN meeting is the ASEAN-India Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement. This is aimed at strengthening cooperation between the two sides in very many areas: trade, investment, connectivity, and also in security domain, which is a very important aspect as well. So I think this is a main outcome, and Prime Minister's visit to Jakarta has yielded also the India's position on ASEAN, the strengthening of relations. Other members of the ASEAN have also been very fruitful, and I think this is a major outcome. You mentioned about the last few years of engagement. I think the visit by the ASEAN leaders for the Republic Day function has been the highlight of the India-ASEAN meetings. And if you look at the bilateral trade, if you look at the Kaladan project and the highway project to Vientiane, and much progress has been made. The BIMSTEC process that India had furthered through the representation of BIMSTEC at some of the multilateral institutions like the BRICS, and that has enhanced the image of India in the region. Then there is also huge investment flows between India and the ASEAN countries, specifically in relation to Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. There has been a lot of investment flow. Two-way flow has occurred. Singapore is one of the largest investors in India, and the free trade area that has been cobbled up since 2010, in the past 13 years, that has yielded so much of progress, nearly above $80 billion of trade between the two sides. And Indian investment in the ASEAN region has also increased substantially. So from that point of view, there is a lot of give and take between the two sides. As far as the security is concerned, Indian president had at the time offered to provide support for the Southeast Asian countries to counter piracy related matters, which has become quite serious in the recent times, with half of the global piracy incidents happening not in the Caribbean, but in the Southeast Asian region. And there is the Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia initiative to counter the piracy incidents. However, there is an offer also by India in the light of the cooperation and the support given by the Indian Navy during the 2004-2005 tsunami incident in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. After that, there has been a lot of goodwill that is generated for India in the non-traditional security challenges, how to cope up with these challenges, including in Myanmar when Operation Nargis was undertaken by the Indian Air Force and provided quick relief in time for the Myanmaris. So from the non-traditional security challenges, there is a suggestion and support given by India to the Southeast Asian countries. It has really gone down well in terms of enhancing India's image in the Southeast Asian region. The Prime Minister also mentioned about the ASEAN outlook and the Indo-Pacific. The Prime Minister mentioned about the Act East policy that India had initiated from the Look East policy of the early 90s to that of Act East policy in 2015. And as a result of that, there has been a number of bilateral and multilateral naval and other exercises, training programs that were conducted between the two armed forces of these formations. So that has been quite a substantial work between ASEAN and India.
But see, Kandapali, ASEAN is central pillar of India's Act East policy, and India fully supports ASEAN centrality and ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So how do you see India-ASEAN cooperation in the maritime domain, especially in the Indo-Pacific, in the context of what Prime Minister said at the ASEAN summit about need for concerted efforts to ensure peace and security in Indo-Pacific?
From the point of view of the recent Indo-Pacific, the first meeting of the Indo-Pacific took place in Da Nang in Vietnam in November 2017. And then the quadrilateral security dialogue was enunciated, and several summit meetings have taken place between the four countries. So what Indo-Pacific is offering ASEAN is the +1 category of membership in future, and possibly Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries are interested in associating with the Indo-Pacific concept. Number one. Number two, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speech at Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018, where India had unveiled its vision for the Indo-Pacific. The Prime Minister mentioned about inclusivity rather than exclusivity of membership of the Indo-Pacific. Secondly, he also mentioned about the centrality of the ASEAN. In the light of some countries trying to divide the ASEAN on the territorial disputes, sovereignty disputes in the maritime domain, India's suggestion for ASEAN centrality has also resulted in India becoming much more close to the Southeast Asian countries who were battered by a number of these sovereignty-related problems. And the speech today also mentions about the rule of law and the ways to settle the issues amicably through dialogue process, and no status quo change be permitted in the region by any actor encroaching islands or others. So from the point of view of Shangri-La Dialogue speech by the Prime Minister, this has been a major strand of the Indian foreign policy, and it did attract the Southeast Asian countries to the Indian position. In addition, of course, as we were discussing, there is India has become ASEAN's fourth largest trading partner, and ASEAN is India's third largest trading partner. The number of agreements have increased in terms of promoting trade and investments. As a part of this supply chain resurrection after the COVID-19 pandemic had hit the globe since late 2019, early 2020. And Vaccine Maitri had also done wonders in terms of the ASEAN responses towards India in dispersing the vaccines in many of these ASEAN countries. We also had the connectivity, road, railway, ports construction, and air and maritime transportation networks that were discussed previously and also had some impact in the current discussions in the India-ASEAN meeting as well as in the bilateral discussions between the two. Tourism is another sector where we have a lot of progress because the connectivity is improving. There is also the tourism, people-to-people contacts have enhanced. And so I think the Indo-Pacific idea, the plus, Indo-Pacific plus, the Quad plus, these have attracted the ASEAN attention. ASEAN had passed an outlook on the Indo-Pacific. While there are differences between ASEAN and India in terms of the definition of the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless, there is a lot of cooperation that has been exhibited in the two sides. I was mentioning before about the defense ministerial dialogue that India and ASEAN have since 2021. And we have seen, for example, the BrahMos missiles have been now given to Philippines. There is the discussion between Vietnam and India on the same. There is also the Kilo class submarine training program that India does for Vietnam at their request. In addition, there is the space cooperation between Vietnam and India. So a number of areas are now being opened up between India and ASEAN countries. There is also the Blue Economy Initiative 3 years ago in 2020 and furthering the comprehensive strategic partnership in many areas that we just highlighted.
Dr. Kandapali, in a very significant move, Prime Minister Narendra Modi today presented a 12-point proposal to expand cooperation between India and ASEAN in a range of areas. So how do you see this 12-point proposal by Prime Minister Modi to enhance India's overall engagement with ASEAN?
I think this is a very significant initiative that the Prime Minister has made for the ASEAN countries at the 43rd ASEAN Summit meeting. I think, as you highlighted, there is the connectivity issue, the economic corridor, as he mentioned, multimodal connectivity and economic corridor. That is the significant aspect. Connecting Southeast Asia with India and West Asia and Europe. That is the plan that India had in terms of this connectivity project. And the trade is expected to grow out of this connectivity to more than $150 billion in the near future. There is also the Prime Minister's mention about the digital public infrastructure that is offered by India, given the Indian IT sector strength. Also, in terms of maritime safety and disaster management. This has been a key factor, as we were discussing before about the tsunami. There is this offer by the Prime Minister on Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure projects. There is then also the counter-terrorism and cybersecurity aspects, in addition to traditional medicine that is also proposed by the Prime Minister to the ASEAN in the bilateral summit meeting. These are all part of the comprehensive strategic partnership agreements that we signed before. And so it includes the progress that has been made as part of the FTA free-trade area. And so there is a lot of progress there on the connectivity issues.
Professor Kandapal, in his address at the East Asia Summit, Prime Minister Modi strongly called for concerted efforts to strengthen sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. And he reiterated his earlier comments that today's era is not of war and that dialogue and diplomacy is the only path to resolve various conflicts. So how do you see Prime Minister Modi's reiteration?
Yes, indeed. As Prime Minister mentioned in the Samarkand meeting earlier last September, that this is not an era of war, that we are looking forward for economic development, specifically in terms of the impact of the Ukrainian conflict on energy prices, food prices, and fertilizers. So there is that suggestion that we need to enhance the growth rates, economic growth rates, etc. Number one, vis-a-vis the Southeast Asian region, the Prime Minister was mentioning about respect to sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Prime Minister was suggesting that countries should obey the Permanent Court of Arbitration rulings. This is the indirect reference to the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling vis-a-vis the South China Sea. At that time, the Hague Tribunal gave 4 verdicts. Number one, no country can claim sovereignty based on the occupied reefs. And so it had quashed the 9-dashed line. It had quashed indirectly the historical claims of countries concerned as far as the sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea are concerned. Number two, the Permanent Court of Arbitration also had highlighted about the traditional fishing rights of the fishermen who have been fishing for centuries and their natural habitats, fishing habitats. So this has been upheld by the court. Thirdly, it mentioned about the environmental degradation that is happening with the under the sea dredging projects conducted by China and other countries. And so it expressed concerns on the environmental degradation. And finally, it also had mentioned about the EEZs that cannot be drawn from the disputed areas, islands. And hence, the Prime Minister was possibly reminding countries that the sovereignty and territorial integrity issues need to be considered from the point of view of international law, and no unilateral action, no status quo change should happen based on those highly nationalist, jingoist, slogans or historical claims.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on ASEAN, a cornerstone of India's Act East policy. The participants were Professor Srikant Kondapalli, strategic analyst, and Manish Pratim Bhuya, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official.
ये आकाशवाणी है। कार्यक्रम कंट्री वाइड में प्रस्तुत है अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्वच्छ वायु दिवस, स्वास्थ्य और खुशहाली के लिए स्वच्छ वायु पर चर्चा।